When the Church Feared a Woman. Before we begin tonight's journey, if you're enjoying these deep dives into medieval history, I'd love for you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from the shadows of the past. Now, dim the lights and settle in. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a woman so powerful, so dangerous, that the most mighty institution in medieval Europe, the Church itself, trembled at the sound of her name. Not because she commanded armies, not because she held a crown, but because she did something far more threatening. She claimed to speak directly to God, and people believed her. Millions of people believed her. And when the Church tried to silence her, when they brought the full weight of their authority against her, she didn't break. She didn't recant. She stood her ground, and in doing so, she revealed a crack in the foundation of everything medieval society believed about power, gender, and divine authority. This is the story of how one woman's visions nearly split the Church in two, how her words traveled faster than any army could march, and how her death, when it finally came, only made her more powerful. The Church feared her in life. They feared her even more in death. And the question that haunted them for centuries afterward was this: what if she was right? Hold in your mind the image of a single candle flame in a vast cathedral. The cathedral is stone and power and centuries of tradition, massive and immovable. The flame is small, fragile, easily extinguished. But here's what the Church discovered. You can blow out a candle, but you cannot blow out an idea. And this woman, this dangerous, unstoppable woman, was not just a person. She was an idea that refused to die. The thesis we'll return to throughout this night is simple but revolutionary. The voice that cannot be silenced is the one that speaks what others only whisper. And when that voice belongs to someone who should have no voice at all, it becomes more dangerous than any weapon. Our story begins not in a palace or a battlefield, but in a village so small it barely had a name, somewhere in the rolling hills of what would later be called Germany in the early 12th century. The exact year doesn't matter as much as the season. It's autumn, the time when the harvest comes in, when the people who have survived another year give thanks, and when those who haven't survived are mourned and buried. This is a world of subsistence, where most people live and die within 20 miles of where they were born, where hunger is always one bad harvest away, where the Church is the only institution that connects the local to the universal, the earthly to the eternal. In this village lives a girl. Let's call her Hildegard, though that wasn't necessarily her name. It's a name that means battle guard or protector in war, and it will prove fitting. Hildegard is 8 years old, the 10th child of a minor noble family, which means she's excess, a daughter with no particular value in a world where daughters are bargaining chips in marriage alliances or surplus labor for household work. But Hildegard's family is pious, and they have made a promise to God. They will tithe their 10th child to the Church, a practice common among medieval Christians who believed that giving 1/10 of everything, grain, livestock, children, was a holy obligation. So, Hildegard, at 8 years old, is given to the Church, not sold, not abandoned, but given as an offering, a gift to God. She is taken to a Benedictine monastery and placed in the care of an anchoress named Jutta. An anchoress is a woman who has chosen to be sealed into a cell attached to the monastery church, to spend her life in prayer and contemplation, cut off from the world, living as if already dead to earthly concerns. Jutta's cell has one window looking into the church, so she can participate in the Mass, and one window to the outside, through which food is passed and through which she offers spiritual counsel to those who seek it. Hildegard will live with Jutta in this cell, learning to read Latin, studying scripture, praying the hours, preparing for a life of religious devotion. This should be where Hildegard disappears from history. Anchoresses don't make waves. They live hidden, holy lives and die forgotten, except by the monks who seal their cells when they're gone. But Hildegard is different, has always been different, in ways she doesn't yet understand. She sees things other people don't see. She experiences visions, not dreams, not fantasies, but waking visions that she describes as seeing with the eyes of her soul. Lights, patterns, voices, images that seem more real than the physical world around her. Modern scholars have speculated that these might have been migraine auras or some neurological condition. But to Hildegard, and to those around her, these visions are visitations, moments when the barrier between earth and heaven becomes thin enough to see through. At first, Hildegard is frightened by her visions. She tells Jutta about them, expecting to be told she's imagining things, or that these are temptations from demons. But Jutta, who has devoted her life to understanding the movements of the spirit, recognizes something genuine in Hildegard's accounts. She doesn't dismiss them, she doesn't discourage them. Instead, she teaches Hildegard to pay attention, to remember, to discern. This is a crucial moment, though neither of them knows it yet. Jutta is giving Hildegard permission to trust her inner experience, to believe that what she sees might be real and important. In a world where women are taught from birth that their perceptions are unreliable, their judgments suspect, their voices unauthoritative, this permission is radical. Years pass. Hildegard grows from child to woman in the anchoress's cell, learning not just scripture, but music, healing arts, the natural world observed through her narrow window. She continues to have visions, and she continues to record them, writing them down in Latin, the language of the church and of learning. She's developing skills that no one planned for her to have. She's becoming educated, literate, theologically sophisticated, at a time when most women and most men can't read their own names. And she's doing it all hidden away, unnoticed by the wider world, preparing without knowing she's preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. When Hildegard is 38 years old, Jutta dies. This is a crisis. The anchoress's cell has been the center of religious life for the women attached to this monastery. A small community has formed around Jutta, women seeking religious devotion under her guidance. With Jutta gone, this community needs a leader. The logical choice is Hildegard. She knows the life, she knows the prayers, she has lived it longer than anyone else. The monks of the monastery elect her as magistra, the female superior of this small women's community. Hildegard accepts, though with reluctance. She has no desire for authority. She wants only to continue her life of prayer and vision. But then something happens that will change everything. Hildegard, now in a position of leadership, receives a vision unlike any she has had before. A voice. She describes it as a voice from heaven. Commands her to write down her visions and share them publicly. Not to keep them private as she has for 3 decades. Not to whisper them only to her confessor, but to publish them. To send them out into the world. To let people read and judge for themselves what God has shown her. This is a terrifying command. Women in the 12th century do not publish theological works. They do not claim divine authority. They do not insert themselves into the conversations that shape Christian doctrine. The penalty for presumption, for false prophecy, for heresy is severe. Excommunication at minimum, death at maximum. Hildegard knows this. She resists the command. She becomes physically ill, paralyzed with what she describes as a sickness brought on by her disobedience to the divine voice. Only when she agrees to begin writing, to make her visions public, does her health return. So, Hildegard begins to write. She writes in Latin, the language of authority, but she writes from a position of claimed powerlessness. She calls herself a poor little figure of a woman, unlearned, a feather on the breath of God. This rhetoric of humility is partly genuine. She does see herself as merely an instrument, but it's also strategic. If she's just a vessel, if the words come not from her but through her, then she can't be accused of presumption. God is speaking. She's just the secretary. This is the formula that will allow her to say things no woman should be able to say and survive. But before she can publish anything, Hildegard knows she needs authorization. She needs someone with unquestionable authority to vouch for her, to say that her visions are genuine and not demonic delusions or presumptuous fantasies. So, she writes to the most powerful churchman she can reach, Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential abbot in Europe, advisor to popes, preacher of crusades, a man whose word carries weight across the Christian world. She sends him samples of her visions and asks for his judgment. This is an extraordinary gamble. Bernard could destroy her with a word. He could declare her visions false, her presumption sinful, her entire enterprise heretical. But Bernard reads what she has sent, and he responds cautiously but positively. He tells her to continue, to be humble, to test everything carefully. But he does not condemn her. This is not exactly an enthusiastic endorsement, but it's not a condemnation either. And in the dangerous game Hildegard is playing, not being condemned by Bernard of Clairvaux, is almost as good as being approved by him. Armed with Bernard's cautious blessing, Hildegard continues writing. She completes her first major work, a text called Scivias, Know the Ways, a massive theological vision describing the structure of the cosmos, the nature of salvation, the relationship between God and humanity, the role of the church, the meaning of the sacraments. It is learned, complex, sophisticated, and utterly confident in its claims about divine truth. She sends copies to the Pope. She sends copies to bishops and abbots. She makes sure the most powerful men in the church know what she is doing. And here's where something remarkable happens. Instead of being silenced, Hildegard is celebrated. The Pope reads her work and, at the urging of Bernard and others, sends a commission to investigate her. The commission comes to her monastery, examines her, interrogates her, reads her writings, and reports back that her visions appear genuine. The Pope, in an extraordinary move, writes to Hildegard giving her permission to continue publishing her visions. He doesn't exactly say her visions are certainly from God. Popes are cautious about such claims, but he says she should continue her work under proper spiritual direction. This is the authorization she needs. The Pope himself has told her to keep writing. The voice that cannot be silenced is the one that speaks what others only whisper. What was Hildegard saying that gave her such power? On the surface, her theological writings are orthodox, traditional, in line with church teaching. She affirms the Trinity, the sacraments, the authority of the church, the reality of sin and redemption. But embedded in her visions are ideas that challenge the distribution of power in her society. She writes about the feminine aspect of the divine, about wisdom personified as a woman, about the church as bride and mother. She writes about the responsibility of the powerful to the powerless, about corruption in the church hierarchy, about priests and bishops who fail in their duties. She writes about the dignity of the body, about the goodness of creation, about sexuality within marriage as holy rather than merely tolerated. These ideas aren't heretical, but they're uncomfortable. They suggest that the world might be organized differently, that authority might be questioned, that even women might have valuable insights into the nature of God, and people listen, not just monks and bishops, though she corresponds with them extensively. Common people begin to make pilgrimages to her monastery to hear her preach. Yes, preach, though technically she calls it exhortation, to avoid the prohibition against women preaching. They come seeking healing because Hildegard has also become known as a healer, using herbs and natural remedies and music and prayer to treat illness. They come seeking prophecy because Hildegard's visions sometimes include predictions about future events, warnings about wars and upheavals. They come seeking someone who speaks with authority about God, but who isn't part of the male clerical hierarchy that normally mediates all religious experience. This is when the church begins to feel uneasy. It's one thing for a holy woman to have visions in a convent. It's another thing entirely for her to become a public figure, drawing crowds, corresponding with emperors and popes, inserting herself into theological and political debates. Some churchmen start to question whether Hildegard has overstepped. Some suggest she should be silenced, that her continued public activity is inappropriate for a woman. But by now, Hildegard has powerful protectors, and she has the Pope's authorization, and she has a reputation for holiness that makes attacking her dangerous. If you attack a genuine visionary, you might be attacking someone God has chosen, which would be a grave sin. The church is trapped by its own theology. It claims to value prophecy and vision, and Hildegard fits the criteria of a genuine visionary too well to dismiss easily. So Hildegard continues, growing bolder. At age 50, she receives another vision, telling her to leave the monastery where she has lived for over 40 years and establish a new community. She finds a location, a hilltop called Rupertsberg, and she begins to build. The monks of her current monastery resist. They don't want to lose the prestige and the donations that flow to them because of Hildegard's presence. But Hildegard is immovable. She has her vision, she has her authorization, and she has learned how to use her spiritual authority as a weapon. She essentially goes on spiritual strike, becoming ill again, refusing to perform her duties, until the monks relent and allow her to leave. It's a brilliant piece of power, politics dressed up as holy obedience. At Rupertsberg, Hildegard creates something new, a women's monastery that she controls completely, where women can study and pray and create without male oversight, except what church law requires. She builds a church, a cloister, living quarters. She composes music, liturgical songs of stunning complexity and beauty, pushing the boundaries of what medieval music can do. She writes more books, medical texts, natural history, theological works, letters to seemingly everyone of importance in Europe. She goes on preaching tours, traveling to cities and monasteries across Germany, drawing crowds wherever she speaks. She is, by any measure, one of the most influential religious figures of her age, and she is a woman in an institution that officially teaches that women should be silent, submissive, and invisible. But the price hadn't yet been paid. Hildegard's authority rested on a delicate balance. As long as she claimed to speak only as God's instrument, as long as she maintained the rhetoric of feminine weakness and divine empowerment, as long as she had powerful male protectors, she was safe. But that balance could be upset, and as Hildegard aged and became more confident, she began to push boundaries more aggressively. The crisis comes near the end of her life, when Hildegard is in her 80s, an extraordinary age for the 12th century. A young nobleman dies and is buried in Hildegard's monastery cemetery. Sometime before his death, he had been excommunicated by the church for some political offense. The details are murky. The local church authorities, learning of this burial, demand that Hildegard exhume the body and remove it from consecrated ground. Excommunicates cannot be buried in holy ground. That's church law, clear and unambiguous. Hildegard refuses. She claims that the young man had reconciled with the church before his death, that he had received the sacraments, that his excommunication had been lifted. She has no documentation of this. Perhaps the reconciliation was done privately, or perhaps it didn't happen at all, and she's lying to protect the young man's soul. We don't know. What we know is that she refuses the order, and more than that, she has her nuns physically obscure the grave so the authorities can't find it to exhume it. This is open defiance of ecclesiastical authority. The local prelates respond by placing Hildegard's entire monastery under interdict. This means no masses can be said, no sacraments can be administered, no liturgical music can be performed. For a community whose entire life revolves around the daily rhythm of sung prayer, this is devastating. The interdict is meant to force submission. Hildegard is supposed to back down, apologize, exhume the body, and restore normal order. She doesn't. For months, Hildegard and her community endure the interdict, while she writes letters to bishops and archbishops arguing her case, claiming that the young man was wrongly excommunicated in the first place, that the authorities are abusing their power, that God has shown her the truth of the matter. She's using every ounce of her accumulated spiritual authority to resist institutional authority. It's an incredibly dangerous position. She's an old woman fighting the entire church hierarchy. By any logic, she should lose. But she doesn't lose. Eventually, after months of negotiation and letter writing and political maneuvering, the interdict is lifted. The official reason given is that Hildegard has satisfactorily explained the situation, and that doubts have been raised about the validity of the young man's excommunication. The real reason is probably that Hildegard is too famous, too well connected, too politically costly to punish. The church backs down. An 80-year-old woman has successfully defied ecclesiastical authority and won. Hildegard dies shortly after, at age 81, in the year of our Lord, 1179. She dies in her monastery, surrounded by her nuns, having successfully established a legacy that includes books, music, a thriving religious community, and a model of female spiritual authority that will inspire and trouble the church for centuries. Her death is marked by visions reported by her community, lights in the sky, signs and wonders. She is immediately venerated as a saint by those who knew her, though formal canonization will take centuries because the church, even in death, is uncomfortable with what she represents. So, why did the church fear this woman? Let's unpack the mechanism of that fear, because it reveals something profound about power, gender, and religious authority in the medieval world. First, Hildegard threatened the monopoly on religious interpretation. The medieval church's power rested on being the exclusive mediator between God and humanity. Priests administered sacraments, bishops taught doctrine, the Pope interpreted scripture. Ordinary people accessed the divine through these official channels, but Hildegard claimed direct access to God, and she did it so convincingly that people believed her. This meant the clerical hierarchy wasn't necessary for understanding God's will, at least not always, not for everyone. If God could speak directly to an uneducated woman, as she claimed to be, what did that say about the necessity of the educated male clergy? The church couldn't outright deny the possibility of direct divine communication. That would contradict too much of scripture and tradition. But they also couldn't endorse it too enthusiastically without undermining their own authority. Second, Hildegard exposed the gap between the church's ideals and its practices. In her visions and letters, she frequently criticized clerical corruption, simony, sexual impropriety among priests and bishops, the pursuit of worldly power over spiritual duties. These criticisms came from a place of loyalty. She wanted the church to be better, not to be destroyed, but they were still dangerous. They suggested that the institution claiming to represent God on earth was failing in that representation. And because Hildegard claimed divine authorization for her criticisms, they couldn't be dismissed as mere personal opinion. If God was showing her the church's failures, then those failures needed to be addressed, and the people being criticized might need to be removed from power. Third, Hildegard demonstrated that women could be theologians, leaders, teachers, and prophets without ceasing to be Orthodox Christians. She didn't reject church teaching, she worked within it, but she pushed its boundaries. She showed that the exclusion of women from religious authority was a matter of custom and law, not divine necessity. After all, if God chose to speak through a woman, if God gave a woman visions of theological truth, if God commanded a woman to teach and preach and write, who were mere men to say women couldn't do these things? Hildegard's very existence as a successful religious authority was an argument against the structures that said women couldn't have such authority. Fourth, Hildegard created an alternative power center. Her monastery, her writings, her correspondence network, her reputation for holiness and prophecy, all of this added up to a form of power that existed alongside, and sometimes in tension with, official church hierarchy. When people wanted spiritual guidance, they could go to their parish priest, or they could write to Hildegard. When rulers wanted to know God's will, they could consult bishops, or they could consult Hildegard. She didn't overthrow the hierarchy, but she created a parallel structure that didn't depend on it. This was threatening because it suggested that the official structures weren't sufficient, that power and authority could flow through channels the church didn't control. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, Hildegard proved that the voice that cannot be silenced is the one that speaks what others only whisper. She said things that many people thought but didn't dare say, that the powerful often abuse their authority, that corruption riddles the church, that women have spiritual insights worth hearing, that the body and the material world are good and holy, that love and beauty and creativity reflect the divine. These weren't revolutionary ideas in the sense of being completely new. They had roots in scripture and tradition, but they were revolutionary in being spoken publicly, insistently, by someone who refused to be quiet. And once spoken, they couldn't be unspoken. Hildegard's writings circulated. Her music was sung. Her ideas influenced other women who sought religious authority. The church could have killed her, could have burned her books, but by the time they might have been willing to take such extreme action, it was too late. She was too famous, her ideas too widespread, her legacy too established. The church's fear of Hildegard was not irrational. She genuinely threatened their monopoly on religious authority and their control over how Christianity was practiced and understood. But the church was also trapped by its own principles. It claimed to value prophecy, so it couldn't easily dismiss a genuine prophet. It claimed that God worked through unexpected people, so it couldn't argue that God would never speak through a woman. It claimed that holiness mattered more than earthly status, so it couldn't say that Hildegard's visions were invalid just because she was female. Hildegard had turned the church's own theology against its patriarchal structures, and there was no good response that didn't either abandon the theology or acknowledge the contradiction. Let's look now at what happened after Hildegard's death, because the aftermath reveals the full scope of her impact. In the immediate years following her passing, her community continued to thrive. The monastery at Rupertsberg became a pilgrimage site. Her writings continued to circulate, copied by scribes in monasteries across Europe. Her music was performed. Her medical texts were consulted. Petitions were sent to Rome asking for her formal canonization as a saint, though these petitions stalled, probably because powerful factions in the church still found her troubling even in death. Yes, but Hildegard's real legacy was the model she provided for other women. In the centuries after her death, we see an explosion of female mystics, visionaries, and religious writers in Europe. Women like Mechthild of Magdeburg, Gertrude the Great, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, Birgitta of Sweden, all of them claimed direct divine communication. All of them wrote theology. All of them challenged aspects of church authority while remaining technically orthodox. Hildegard had shown that this was possible, that a woman could have spiritual authority, could speak truth to power, could survive, and even flourish. The path she blazed became a highway. The church responded to this proliferation of female visionaries with increasing anxiety and increasing control. By the 13th and 14th centuries, inquisitions were established partly to regulate and suppress unauthorized religious movements, including those led by women. The Beguines, communities of religious women who lived without taking formal vows and without male oversight, were repeatedly investigated and sometimes condemned as heretical. The church developed elaborate tests for distinguishing true visions from false ones, criteria that conveniently made it easier to dismiss women's spiritual experiences as delusion or demonic deception. The very success of Hildegard's model provoked a backlash designed to ensure no other woman could do what she had done. Yet, the model persisted. Even as the church tried to control and contain female spiritual authority, women continued to claim visions, to write, to teach, to lead. Some, like Catherine of Siena, achieved tremendous influence, advising popes and calling for church reform. Some, like Joan of Arc, were eventually executed when their spiritual claims conflicted too directly with political and ecclesiastical authority. Some, like Julian of Norwich, lived quiet lives of contemplation, but left writings that would be read and treasured for centuries. The feminine voice in medieval Christianity, once awakened, could not be fully silenced. The Reformation of the 16th century brought new questions about Hildegard's legacy. Protestant reformers, who rejected the Catholic veneration of saints and questioned the validity of mystical visions, had little use for her. Catholic counter-Reformation thinkers, while defending the possibility of visions, were cautious about promoting medieval women whose independent spiritual authority might seem to undermine clerical hierarchy. Hildegard fell into relative obscurity for several centuries, remembered by scholars and Benedictines, but largely forgotten by the wider culture. Her rediscovery came in the 20th century, driven by several converging factors. Feminist scholars looking for female voices in history found in Hildegard a remarkable example of a woman who achieved influence and authority in a deeply patriarchal society. Musicians discovered her compositions and began performing them, revealing a musical genius who had been overlooked. Medical historians examined her writings on health and healing, finding surprisingly sophisticated observations about the natural world. Theologians revisited her mystical writings and found fresh relevance in her vision of cosmic interconnection and divine creativity. By the late 20th century, Hildegard had become a cultural phenomenon, celebrated as a composer, a healer, a scientist, a feminist pioneer, and a mystic. The Catholic Church, after centuries of hesitation, finally completed her canonization process in 2012 and declared her a doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women to receive that title, which recognizes someone whose theological writings have universal significance for Christianity. It took 8 centuries, but the Church finally officially acknowledged what people in Hildegard's own lifetime had known, that she was a spiritual genius whose insights mattered, whose voice deserved to be heard, whose authority was genuine. But here's the paradox. In celebrating Hildegard now, the Church sometimes domesticates her, smooths over the sharp edges of her challenge to authority, presents her as a model of feminine holiness who knew her place. The Hildegard celebrated in official church documents is often gentle, humble, obedient, emphasizing her rhetoric of weakness rather than her actual exercise of power. The real Hildegard was more complicated, more difficult, more threatening. She was a woman who defied church authorities when she thought they were wrong, who built an independent power base, who never apologized for claiming divine authorization for her words and actions. The real Hildegard is not comfortable to institutional authority, then or now. She remains dangerous precisely because her model suggests that spiritual authority doesn't have to flow through official channels, that women don't have to accept the roles assigned to them, that the voice that speaks truth has a power that institutions cannot fully control. What lessons can we draw from Hildegard's story? What does this medieval woman who challenged the church have to teach us across the centuries? Let me offer 5 gentle reflections, universal truths that transcend the specifics of 12th century Christianity. First, authority is not the same as power. Hildegard had no official authority. She held no church office. She couldn't ordain priests or consecrate bishops. She couldn't change doctrine or law. But she had power, the power of a compelling voice, the power of claimed divine communication, the power of a reputation for holiness. She exercised that power brilliantly, using it to accomplish things that should have been impossible for a woman in her time. The lesson is that when formal authority is denied to us, we can still cultivate other forms of power. We can develop expertise, build networks, establish credibility, speak truth persuasively. Authority is what institutions grant. Power is what we create. Second, strategic weakness can be a form of strength. Hildegard constantly called herself weak, unlearned, merely a vessel for divine wisdom. This rhetoric protected her. If she was just God's instrument, she couldn't be accused of presumption. If she was weak, she couldn't be seen as a threat. If she claimed no credit for her insights, she couldn't be attacked for pride. But behind this rhetoric of weakness was immense strength of will, intellect, and ambition. She wanted to write, to teach, to build, to influence. And she found a way to do all of that by draping it in the language of submission. The lesson is not that we should be dishonest about our abilities, but that we should be strategic about how we present ourselves in contexts where direct assertion of strength invites attack. Sometimes the path to influence runs through apparent humility. Third, the stories we tell about ourselves shape the possibilities we can imagine. Hildegard told a story about herself, in which God could speak through anyone, even a woman, even someone without formal education or authority. That story opened space for her to do things that the dominant narratives of her culture said were impossible. Other women, hearing her story, could imagine similar possibilities for themselves. The lesson is that narrative matters. The way we frame our lives, the stories we tell about who we are and what we can do, either constrain or expand our possibilities. If we accept stories that limit us, we will be limited. If we create alternative stories that imagine greater possibilities, we create space to realize those possibilities. Fourth, institutions fear voices they cannot control, but that fear is also a kind of power. The church feared Hildegard because they couldn't fully control her. She claimed an authority outside their hierarchy. She spoke truths they found uncomfortable. She created a following that looked to her rather than to official channels. That fear gave her leverage. They couldn't silence her without risking backlash, couldn't attack her without seeming to attack genuine holiness, couldn't ignore her without ceding ground to her alternative authority. The lesson is that when we speak truths that powerful institutions find threatening, their very discomfort reveals our impact. If they're trying to silence us, it's because our voice matters. If they're afraid, it's because we have power. Fifth, the voice that cannot be silenced is the one that speaks what others only whisper. Hildegard's power came not from saying things no one had ever thought, but from saying publicly what many thought privately. She spoke about corruption in the church, about the spiritual authority of women, about the dignity of the body, about the failure of leaders to live up to their responsibilities. These ideas resonated because people already sensed their truth, but no one with credibility had articulated them. When we speak the whispered truths, when we give voice to what people already half know but haven't quite said, we tap into enormous power. We're not alone in our perceptions. We're just willing to speak them. These lessons from Hildegard's medieval world apply far beyond religion and far beyond her century. They speak to anyone who has been told they have no voice, to anyone whose perspective has been dismissed, to anyone who sees truths that powerful institutions would prefer remained unspoken. They speak to the possibility of claiming authority even when it's denied, of finding strength in apparent weakness, of telling stories that expand rather than constrain, of troubling the powerful, of speaking what others only whisper. These are tools for anyone on the margins who refuses to stay there. Let's return to the candle flame we imagined at the beginning, that small, flickering light in the vast stone cathedral. The church tried to control that flame, to make it burn only where and how they wanted. But Hildegard's flame had a life of its own. It grew brighter, drew crowds, lit other candles. And when the church tried to blow it out, when they imposed their interdict and demanded submission, the flame burned on, protected by its own light, sustained by something the church's breath couldn't extinguish. That flame is still burning. Hildegard's music is still sung. Her writings are still read. Her model of female spiritual authority is still invoked. The church that feared her eventually had to honor her, to admit that the flame they couldn't control was actually holy fire, that the voice they tried to silence was actually speaking truth, that the woman they wanted to contain was actually moved by the spirit they claimed to serve. The candle flame teaches us this. You don't need to be large to give light. You don't need official permission to burn. You don't need institutional approval to illuminate. You just need to refuse to be extinguished. And if you burn bright enough, if you persist long enough, if you light enough other candles, eventually even the vast stone cathedral must acknowledge your light and stop pretending you're not there. Hildegard burned bright. She lit other candles. And 800 years later, we're still seeing by her light, still learning from her example, still inspired by the proof she offers that one voice, even one that should have no voice at all, can speak truths that change the world. The story of the woman the church feared is ultimately a story about the impossibility of permanently silencing truth. The church had every advantage: institutional power, legal authority, theological tradition, social control. The ability to excommunicate and condemn and destroy. Hildegard had only her visions, her words, her persistence, and her willingness to risk everything for the truth as she understood it. By any reasonable calculation, the church should have won. Hildegard should have been silenced, forgotten, erased. But she wasn't. The voice that cannot be silenced is the one that speaks what others only whisper. And Hildegard spoke so clearly, so persistently, so courageously, that even the medieval church at the height of its power couldn't make her be quiet. There's comfort in this story, especially for anyone who feels voiceless, for anyone who has been told to be silent, for anyone whose truth is dismissed or denied. Hildegard proves that systems of power, no matter how massive and ancient and seemingly immovable, are never as absolute as they pretend to be. There are always cracks, always possibilities, always ways for determined voices to be heard. It's not easy. Hildegard paid a price for her voice, endured resistance and criticism and attempts at silencing throughout her life. But she succeeded. She spoke. She was heard. And centuries after her death, she's still speaking, still being heard, still teaching us that the voice that cannot be silenced is the one that speaks truth. As you drift towards sleep tonight, hold that image of the candle flame in the cathedral. See it flickering but persistent, small but bright, vulnerable but ultimately inextinguishable. That flame is Hildegard. That flame is every voice that refuses to be silent. That flame is the possibility that lives in each of us, the possibility that we might speak truth, might challenge power, might light other candles, might burn bright enough that even the vast stone structures that claim to contain us must ultimately acknowledge our light. The church feared a woman, but fear is evidence of power. They feared her because she mattered, because her voice carried weight, because her vision offered an alternative to their authority. And in the end, despite all their institutional advantages, despite centuries of trying to control how she's remembered and understood, the woman they feared is now honored. The voice they tried to silence is amplified across centuries. The light they tried to extinguish illuminates still. Sleep knowing that truth has a power institutions cannot fully contain, that voices speaking what needs to be said can be suppressed but not eliminated, that the small flame of one person's courage can light fires that burn for centuries. Sleep knowing that Hildegard's story is not just history but encouragement, not just past but present, not just one woman's victory but proof of what becomes possible when we refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose. The candle burns, the voice speaks, the truth persists. And tomorrow, or whenever you need to hear it again, return to these stories from the medieval world, where we find not just the past, but ourselves, not just distant figures, but mirrors, not just history, but hope. And if you found meaning in this journey through medieval shadows and light, I hope you'll subscribe and join me for the next story, because there are so many more voices waiting to be heard, so many more candles waiting to be lit, so many more truths waiting to be spoken into the listening night. Until we meet again, rest in the knowledge that the flame cannot be extinguished, the voice cannot be silenced, and the woman the church feared speaks still.